Hi, how you doing? Justin here. In this lesson today, I'm going to do a beginner's guide to arpeggios. I've seen a lot of people pretty confused about what arpeggios are, how to use them and how to get started using them. So I want to explain a bit of the basics in this lesson today. So the first thing is, what is an arpeggio? So I tend to think of an arpeggio as a liquid chord. Well, you could think of a chord as a frozen arpeggio, I guess. And if we put that into practice right away, a good way of understanding it is to think of an open G chord. If you play a regular open G, the notes that you're playing are G, B, D, G, B, and G again. And if we play those notes one at a time, we're playing an arpeggio. G, B, D, G, B, D, G. Now I'll get a little thing out of the way here. Some people find it a little confusing, this commonly used term in guitar language, arpeggiating or arpeggiated. What this commonly means is when somebody holds down a chord and picks notes out from the chord. So that kind of thing. It's kind of referred to as arpeggiated or arpeggiating a chord. It is kind of, I guess, playing an arpeggio because you're playing one note at a time from the chord, but it's not playing an arpeggio in the real sense that we're talking about using them now. What I'm talking about is more of a kind of a lead guitar thing than a rhythm guitar thing. So don't let that term confuse you. What we're talking about is arpeggios, i.e. lead guitar, and that would be arpeggiating or arpeggiated, which is kind of a rhythm guitar technique. So scales versus arpeggios. A lot of people are a bit confused about what the difference is between a scale and arpeggio. So with a scale, you tend to learn one scale that's played over a group of chords in a key. So you can think of it like in a blues. You've got, say, a blues in G, has the chords G, C7 and D7, or G7, C7 and D7, and you would often play over that a G minor pentatonic scale over the whole thing. It's kind of playing in a key. You're learning a scale to play in a key. This also works, of course, with the major scale. The chords in the key of G would be G major, A minor, B minor, C major, D major, E minor, F sharp half diminished or F sharp minor 7 flat 5, which is called no one uses, so don't worry about it. And G, good song example, I don't know, Wish You Were Here, Wonderful Tonight. There's lots of songs in the key of G. And if you were soloing, you might play the G major scale over the whole thing. You wouldn't have to be thinking about the chords too much. You just tend to think about the scale, and that fits over all of the chords. But there comes a point where that's not enough anymore, where it's not right just to play the scale over a whole bunch of chords, because really you want to be a little bit more specific than that. I often think of it like if you're playing in a band, if the soloist is thinking of a scale instead of the chords, he's kind of talking without listening to what the rest of the band is talking about. So the band can be doing whatever they like, and he's just away in his little scale world where when you start thinking of chords, you're playing with the band because the band are all saying G7 and you're saying G7. You're saying the same thing, and it kind of makes it stronger. And one thing that you'll find with arpeggios, the more that you study them, is they're used all the time. Nearly all of the great guitar players are using arpeggios. Maybe not as much as they've practiced their arpeggios and they're using them, but they're using the strong chord tones, the notes that come from the chords. Even a lot of the old blues guys, who I'm really certain never studied their arpeggios, B.B. King or Albert King, they tend to use the strong notes from the chords, the arpeggio notes. They kind of selected, the notes from the minor pentatonic scale that work best with that chord. So they're in effect using arpeggios too. So the big difference between scales and arpeggios is that with arpeggios you think of an individual chord. If we were playing a blues in the key of A, you wouldn't any longer be thinking of, say, the A minor pentatonic scale over the whole A blues progression. You'd be thinking of A7 arpeggio when there's an A7 chord, and when the chord changes to D7, you'd be playing a D7 arpeggio. This sounds really cool. It's pretty complicated, and I still remember the first time I tried to do this, sitting on the floor in my lounge room back in Tasmania with my mate Andy, and we were trying to play a Miles Davis song called Freddie Freeloader, and neither of us could believe the idea that we had to change arpeggios each time the chord changed. It was just seemed impossible, you know. But after maybe a few weeks, or it might have even been a couple of months thinking about it, we managed to get it together, and we could kind of play through that song. It was just a blues, but it's, you know, it's a bit tricky when you're used to playing a scale all of the way through, and then suddenly you have to think of, you know, you're listening to the band to find when the chord changes, and when the chord changes you have to remember what the chord is and then play suitable notes from the arpeggios. Now, all that makes it sound a little bit kind of more complicated than it really is, to tell the truth, because after you've learned them you tend to forget about them and just let your fingers and your ears do the walking. So it's not really a intellectual exercise, but at the beginning it is. When you first learn these arpeggios and you start to use them, you will find it pretty complicated. Now there's another really good reason to learn arpeggios, and that is when you're playing in a key, very often you'll find one chord that doesn't fit with the whole key. And a lot of people get a bit bummed out with that. They don't know what it is that they're going to play. You know, we were talking about Wish You Were Here and stuff before. All of those chords are in the same key. So you can just play that one scale over the whole song and it sounds great. But you also find very often a chord that'll just sneak in there that's not in the key. A really common one would be in the key of G. You have a chord sequence that goes something like G to C to B7 to E minor. Now the chords G, C and E minor are all found in the key of G, so they're no problem. But when it comes to that B7, particularly it's got one note here, it's got this note and a D sharp. Now that D sharp will sound really funny if you play a D or an E over the top of it, i.e. you just stick to your G major scale. So at that point you would change. You would be playing G major scale, still G major, B7, E minor. At that little point, just where it goes to the B7, you'd have to run up your B7 arpeggio. So it's a very, very useful thing to be able to learn your arpeggio shapes, so that when you come across a chord that's not diatonic, i.e. it's not in the key, that you know how to handle it, that you can keep playing through that. A lot of people just think of the shapes on the guitar, to be honest, and just pick one or two of the notes that kind of directly from the chord shape that they might play, which works. It's kind of the same as using an arpeggio, but you're better off using your arpeggio shapes. Now, as well as that, you could use the arpeggios even when it doesn't change key, if you like, because then it just sounds, again, stronger, the way I explained with the blues. If you had a chord progression that went G, D, C, G again, you could play, of course, G major scale all over that. But if I play the arpeggio notes, I'm just going to give a funny example moving up and down the neck so you can hear. But you'll hear that you can hear the chord changes are there, even though I'm only playing single lines now. So if I went... you can hear there, that you could hear quite clearly the chord changes. I mean, I deliberately moved around the neck a little bit so you could see where the changes were. But that's a really, really strong way of playing, is playing out of the chords. Mark Knopfler is a fantastic example of a guy that plays out of the chords all the time. If you transcribe any of his songs, or you're learning any of his songs, and you know what the chords are underneath the solo, and you compare what notes he's playing in the solo with the chord that he's playing over, it's very, very chord based, which is fantastic, and it's one of the things that makes his guitar playing sound so great. I'm not saying that you have to, but most of the guys that are good do use this technique. So where do you start? Because there's a whole lot of different arpeggios. If you go on my site, you'll find that there's 5 different arpeggio shapes for 4 different chord types. So that's a lot of stuff. So what is it that you should start with? So what I would really, really recommend is that you start with the dominant 7th arpeggios. One, because you can use them in a blues, and it's a nice easy way to kind of get into the idea of using arpeggio playing. Also, often when there's one chord in a diatonic sequence, like all the chords are in the same key except for one chord, that one chord that's not in key is very often a dominant 7th chord, for a reason I don't want to go into now, secondary dominance for you guys that understand your music theory. But yeah, so there's another good reason to start off with the dominant arpeggios. What you would want to start off with is learning the one based around the E shape, which is with a root on the 6th string. In the key of A, it would sound like this. That would be the first one to learn. And then go about trying to play a blues just using that dominant 7th and move it literally from the 5th fret, where the A is, up to the D at the 10th fret. Try and play a 12-bar blues all of the way through, moving from A, D, A, D, A, E, D, A, E, and back to an A at the end. But that idea, you've just used that one arpeggio shape and you use it for a whole blues. Practice using that one shape. When you feel like you're confident with that, maybe learn the D7 shape. Always starting and ending on the root note, of course, which is kind of based around the A shape. When I'm talking E shape and A shape, I'm referring to the caged system. If you're not familiar with that, you can go and check out the caged system. There's plenty of information on the website about that. And then what you maybe want to try doing is changing between A7 and D7. So if you had 1 bar of A7, 1 bar of D7. So you have A7, D7, try practicing moving between one arpeggio shape and the other. I've got a whole series actually about this very movement and playing using arpeggios. It's called Jazz Up Your Blues, because this is often using arpeggios is always, well not always, very often the first step into jazz for a lot of people. Getting from blues into jazz, you want to learn your arpeggios. In jazz, you use arpeggios all the time. Pretty much you don't use kind of scales in a traditional sense. You can do, of course, but most of the time you're thinking of chords individually because the keys are changing so rapidly that it doesn't really tend to make sense for most songs most of the time. Of course, not all the songs before. Some people have a go at me and say, yeah, so what's only got one key, one chord, one key. Well, actually 2 chords and 2 keys, but now I'm getting pedantic on myself. Anyway, so I would recommend that you get into learning E shape and A shape dominant 7th chords to start off with. Get handy with them and learn to use those over a blues. The next step would be to learn E shape and A shape, so 2 arpeggio shapes for each chord. Major 7, minor 7, dominant 7th, which you should have learned already by now, and minor 7 flat 5. Now I know minor 7 flat 5 might seem a little bit of an odd one to learn, because I've already said once I think in this video that not many people use that chord shape. But it becomes into a tone a little later on. You start to superimpose it over other chords, which I know it sounds really complicated, but it is something that you might get into, and it's worth learning that arpeggio shape while you're at it. Even if it's for the sake of being a completist, learn 2 of each of the major 7, minor 7, dominant 7th, and minor 7 flat 5. If you've got that down, you'll find it really a great stepping point into playing jazz. You'll be able to handle almost any chord that you come to, and that's how you kind of use arpeggios. Hopefully that makes sense. There's some more information about using arpeggios on the website, of course, and if you go and find this lesson on the website, there'll be a link to a forum where if you've got any questions about this rambling long lesson I've done where it's lots of talking, probably a little bit confusing, I'll try and answer as many of your questions on the forum as I can. Hope that makes sense to some or all of you, and I hope it's inspired some of you to get into your arpeggio playing. Have fun. Take care. Bye-bye.